Chapter 4. Elements of a Theory of Hermeneutic Experience. Section 3. Analysis of Historically Affected Consciousness. The limitations of reflective philosophy. We must now ask how knowledge and effect belong together. I have already pointed out above that historically affected consciousness is something other than inquiry into the history of a particular work's effect, as it were, the trace a work leaves behind. It is rather a consciousness of the work itself, and hence itself has an effect. The purpose of the whole account of the formation and fusion of horizons was to show how historically affected consciousness operates. But what sort of consciousness is this? That is the decisive problem. However much we emphasize that historically affected consciousness itself belongs to the effect, what is essential to it as consciousness is that it can rise above that of which it is conscious. The structure of reflexivity is fundamentally given with all consciousness. Thus, this must also be the case for historically affected consciousness. We might also express it thus. When we speak of historically affected consciousness, are we not confined within the immanent laws of reflection, which destroy any immediate effect? Are we not forced to admit that Hegel was right, and regard the basis of hermeneutics as the absolute mediation of history and truth? We cannot underestimate this point. If we think of the historical worldview and its development from Schleiermacher to Dilthey, it was the same everywhere. Everywhere the claim of hermeneutics seems capable of being met only in the infinity of knowledge, in the thoughtful fusion of the whole of tradition with the present. We see it based on the ideal of perfect enlightenment, on the complete limitlessness of our historical horizon, on the abolition of our finiteness in the infinity of knowledge. In short, on the omnipresence of the historically knowing spirit. It is clearly of no fundamental significance that 19th century historicism never expressly acknowledged this consequence. Ultimately, it finds its justification in Hegel, even if the historians, filled with enthusiasm for experience, preferred to quote Schleiermacher and Wilhelm von Humboldt. Neither Schleiermacher nor Humboldt really thought through their positions fully. However much they emphasize the individuality, the barrier of alienness, that our understanding has to overcome, understanding ultimately finds its fulfillment only in an infinite consciousness, just as the idea of individuality finds its ground there as well. The fact that all individuality is pantheistically embraced within the absolute is what makes possible the miracle of understanding. Thus here too being and knowledge interpenetrate each other in the absolute. Neither Schleiermacher's nor Humboldt's Kantianism, then, affirms an independent system distinct from the consummation of speculative idealism in the absolute dialectic of Hegel. The critique of reflective philosophy that applies to Hegel applies to them also. We must ask whether our own attempt at a historical hermeneutics is not subject to the same critique. Have we succeeded in keeping ourselves free from the metaphysical claims of reflective philosophy? Have we legitimated the hermeneutical experience by agreeing with the critique that the young Hegelians leveled at Hegel, a critique that proved historically so important? To do so, we must acknowledge that absolute reflection is powerfully compelling, and admit that Hegel's critics never really succeeded in breaking its magic spell. We can detach the problem of a historical hermeneutics from the hybrid consequences of speculative idealism only if we refuse to be satisfied with the irrationalistic reduction of it, but preserve the truth of Hegel's thought. We are concerned with understanding historically affected consciousness in such a way that the immediacy and superiority of the work does not dissolve into a mere reflective reality in the consciousness of the effect, i.e., we are concerned to conceive a reality that limits and exceeds the omnipotence of reflection. This was precisely the point against which the critique of Hegel was directed, and where the principle of reflective philosophy actually proved itself superior to all its critics. This can be exemplified by Hegel's polemic against Kant's thing in itself. Kant's critical delimitation of reason had limited the application of the categories to the objects of possible experience and declared that the thing in itself behind appearances was unknowable. Hegel's dialectical argument objected that by making this distinction, and separating the appearance from the thing in itself, reason was proving this distinction to be its own. In doing so, it by no means comes up against its own limits. Rather, reason has itself set this limit, and that means it has already gone beyond that limit. What makes a limit always also includes knowledge of what is on both sides of it. It is the dialectic of the limit to exist only by being superseded. Thus, the quality of being in itself that distinguishes the thing in itself from its appearance is in itself only for us. What appears in logical generality in the dialectic of the limit becomes specified in consciousness by the experience that the being in itself distinguished from consciousness is the other of itself, and is known in its truth when it is known as self, i.e., when it knows itself in full and absolute self-consciousness. We will consider the legitimacy and limitations of this argument below. The varied critique of this philosophy of absolute reason by Hegel's critics cannot withstand the logical consequences of total dialectical self-mediation that Hegel has described, especially in his phenomenology, the science of phenomenal knowledge. That the other must be experienced not as the other of myself grasped by pure self-consciousness, but as a thou, this prototype of all objections to the infiniteness of Hegel's dialectic, does not seriously challenge him. The dialectical process of the phenomenology of mind is perhaps determined by nothing so much as by the problem of the recognition of the thou. To mention only a few stages of this history, our own self-consciousness for Hegel attains to the truth of its self-consciousness only by fighting to be recognized by the other person. The immediate relationship between man and woman is the natural knowledge of mutual recognition. Beyond this, conscience represents the spiritual side of being recognized, and the mutual self-recognition in which the spirit is absolute can be attained only via confession and forgiveness. It cannot be denied that Feuerbach and Kierkegaard's objections are already anticipated when Hegel describes these forms of spirit. Polemics against an absolute thinker has itself no starting point. The Archimedean point from which Hegel's philosophy could be toppled can never be found through reflection. The formal superiority of reflective philosophy is precisely that every possible position is drawn into the reflective movement of consciousness coming to itself. The appeal to immediacy, whether of bodily nature, or the thou making claims on us, or the impenetrable factualness of historical accident, or the reality of the relations of production, has always been self-refuting, in that it is not itself an immediate relation, but a reflective activity. The left Hegelian critique of merely intellectual reconciliation that fails to take account of the real transformation of the world, the whole doctrine of the transformation of philosophy into politics, is inevitably the self-abolition of philosophy. Thus, the question arises how far the dialectical superiority of reflective philosophy corresponds to a substantive truth, and how far it merely creates a formal appearance. For the arguments of reflective philosophy cannot ultimately obscure the fact that there is some truth in the critique of speculative thought, based on the standpoint of finite human consciousness. This emerges in particular in the epigonies of idealism, e.g. the neo-Kantian critics of life philosophy and existentialism. Heinrich Rickert, who attempted in 1920 to destroy life philosophy through argument, was unable to come anywhere near the influence of Nietzsche and Dilthey, which was beginning to grow at that time. However clearly one demonstrates the inner contradictions of all relativist views, it is as Heidegger has said, all these victorious arguments have something of the attempt to bowl one over. However cogent they may seem, they still miss the main point. In making use of them, one is proved right, and yet they do not express any superior insight of value. That the thesis of skepticism or relativism refutes itself to the extent that it claims to be true is an irrefutable argument. But what does it achieve? The reflective argument that proves successful here rebounds against the arguer, for it renders the truth value of reflection suspect. It is not the reality of skepticism or of truth-dissolving relativism, but the truth claim of all formal argument that is affected. Thus, the formalism of such reflective argument is of specious philosophical legitimacy. In fact, it tells us nothing. We are familiar with this kind of thing from the Greek sophists, whose inner hollowness Plato demonstrated. It was also he who saw clearly that there is no argumentatively adequate criterion by which to distinguish between truly philosophical and sophistic discourse. In particular, he shows in his 7th letter that the formal refutability of a proposition does not necessarily exclude its being true. The model of all empty argument is the sophistic question how one can inquire into anything that one does not already know. This sophistical objection, which Plato formulates in the Meno, is not, characteristically enough, overcome there through superior argument, but by appealing to the myth of the pre-existence of the soul. This is a very ironic appeal, since the myth of pre-existence and anamnesis, which is supposed to solve the mystery of questioning and seeking, does not present a religious certainty, but depends on the certainty of the knowledge-seeking soul, which prevails against the emptiness of formal arguments. Nevertheless, it is characteristic of the weakness that Plato recognizes in the Logos that he bases his critique of the sophist's argument not on logic, but myth. Just as true opinion is a divine favor and gift, so the search for and recognition of the true Logos is not the free self-possession of the human mind. We will see below that Plato's mythical justification of Socratic dialectic is of fundamental importance. Were not the sophists refuted, and this cannot be done through argument, their argument would lead to resignation. It is the argument of lazy reason, and has a truly symbolic importance, since all empty reflection, despite its appearance of victory, leads to the discrediting of all reflective thought. But however convincing it seems, Plato's mythical refutation of dialectical sophism does not satisfy the modern mind. There is no mythical foundation of philosophy in Hegel. For him, myth is part of pedagogy. Ultimately, reason is its own foundation. By working through the dialectic of reflection as the total self-mediation of reason, Hegel is fundamentally beyond the argumentative formalism that we, like Plato, call sophistical. Hence his dialectic is no less polemical toward the empty arguments of logic, which he calls external reflection, than are the arguments of Plato's Socrates. That is why it is of central importance that the hermeneutical problem come to grips with Hegel. For Hegel's whole philosophy of mind claims to achieve the total fusion of history with the present. It is concerned not with a reflective formalism, but with the same thing as we are. Hegel has thought through the historical dimension in which the problem of hermeneutics is rooted. For this reason, we will have to define the structure of historically affected consciousness with an eye to Hegel, setting it against his own approach. Hegel's spiritualistic interpretation of Christianity, which he uses to define the nature of mind, is not affected by the objection that it leaves no room for the experience of the other and the alterity of history. The life of the mind consists precisely in recognizing oneself in other being. The mind directed toward self-knowledge regards itself as alienated from the positive and must learn to reconcile itself with it, seeing it as its own, as its home. By dissolving the hard edge of positivity, it becomes reconciled with itself. In that this kind of reconciliation is the historical work of the mind. The historical activity of the mind is neither self-reflection nor the merely formal dialectical supersession of the self-alienation that it has undergone, but an experience that experiences reality and is itself real. The concept of experience and the essence of the hermeneutic experience. This is precisely what we have to keep in mind in analyzing historically affected consciousness. It has the structure of experience. However paradoxical it may seem, the concept of experience seems to me one of the most obscure we have. Because it plays an important role in the natural sciences and the logic of induction, it has been subjected to an epistemological schematization that, for me, truncates its original meaning. We may remember that Dilthey accused British empiricism of a lack of historical culture. Considering his unresolved hesitation between life philosophy and philosophy of science, we can regard this as a very half-hearted criticism. In fact, The main deficiency in theory of experience hitherto, and this includes Dilthey himself, is that it is entirely oriented towards science, and hence takes no account of the inner historicity of experience. The aim of science is so to objectify experience, that it no longer contains any historical element. Scientific experiment does this by its methodical procedure. The historico-critical method, moreover, does something similar in the human sciences. Through the objectivity of their approach, both methods are concerned to guarantee that these basic experiences can be repeated by anyone. Just as in the natural sciences experiments must be verifiable, so also must the whole process be capable of being checked in the human sciences also. Hence there can be no place for the historicity of experience in science. In its methodology, modern science thus simply proceeds further toward a goal that experience has always striven after. Experience is valid only if it is confirmed, hence its dignity depends on its being in principle repeatable. But this means that by its very nature, experience abolishes its history and thus itself. This is true even of everyday experience, and much more so of any scientific version of it. Theory of experience is related exclusively teleologically to the truth that is derived from it. And this is not just an accidental one-sidedness in modern scientific theory, but has a foundation in fact. In recent times, Edmund Husserl in particular has directed his attention to this problem. In a series of many investigations, he attempted to throw light on the one-sidedness of the scientific idealization of experience. To this end, he gives a genealogy of the experience which, as experience of the living world, precedes its being idealized by science. To me, however, he still seems dominated by the one-sidedness that he criticizes, for he projects the idealized world of exact scientific experience into the original experience of the world, in that he makes perception, as something directed toward merely external physical appearances, the basis of all other experience. To quote him, although because of this sensible presence it also attracts our practical or affective interest, presenting itself to us at once as something useful, attractive, or repulsive. All this is based on the fact that there is a substratum with qualities that can be apprehended simply by the senses, to which there always leads a path of possible explication. It is easy to see how much the ontological foreconception of presence dominates him. Husserl's attempt to go back genetically to the origin of experience and to overcome its idealization by science obviously has to struggle especially with the difficulty that the pure transcendental subjectivity of the ego is not really given as such, but always given in the idealization of language. Moreover, language is already present in any acquisition of experience, and in it, the individual ego comes to belong to a particular linguistic community. In fact, when we go back to the beginnings of modern scientific theory and logic, we find this same problem. The extent to which there can be such a thing as the pure use of our reason, proceeding according to methodological principles, superior to all prejudices and predispositions, especially verbalistic ones. The particular achievement of Bacon in this field is that he was not satisfied with the immanent logical task of elaborating the theory of experience as the theory of true induction. Instead, he discussed the whole moral difficulty and anthropological questionableness of this kind of experiential product. His method of induction seeks to rise above the irregular and accidental way daily experience occurs, and certainly above its dialectical use. In this connection, he undermined the theory of induction based on enumeratio simplex, still held by humanist scholasticism, an achievement that foreshadowed the new age of scientific method. The concept of induction makes use of the idea that we generalize on the basis of chance observation, and if we encounter no contrary instance, we pronounce it valid. Against anticipatio, this over-hasty generalization of everyday experience, Bacon opposes what he calls interpretatio naturae, i.e. the expert interpretation of the true being of nature. Methodically conducted experiments permit us to progress step by step toward the true and tenable universals, the simple forms of nature. This true method is characterized by the fact that the mind is not left to its own devices, It cannot soar as it would like. Rather, it has to climb gradatim step by step, from the particular to the universal in order to achieve an ordered experience that avoids all hasty conclusions. Bacon himself describes the method he calls for as experimental. But it must be remembered that by experiment, Bacon does not always mean just the scientist's technical procedure of artificially inducing processes under conditions that isolate them and render them capable of being measured. An experiment is also, and primarily, the careful directing of our mind, preventing it from indulging in over-hasty generalizations, consciously confronting it with the most remote and apparently most diverse instances, so that gradually and continuously it can learn to work, via the process of exclusion, toward the axioms. On the whole, we have to agree with the usual criticism of Bacon, and admit that his methodological suggestions are disappointing. As we can see today, they are too vague and general and have produced little, especially when applied to the study of nature. It is true that this opponent of empty dialectical casuistry himself remained profoundly involved in the metaphysical tradition and in the dialectical forms of argument that he attacked. His goal of conquering nature through obedience, the new approach of attacking and forcing nature's secrets from it, which makes him the predecessor of modern science, is only the programmatic side of his work, and his contribution has hardly been enduring. His real achievement is, rather, that he undertakes a comprehensive examination of the prejudices that hold the human mind captive and lead it away from the true knowledge of things. He thus carries out a methodical self-purification of the mind that is more a discipline than a method. Bacon's famous doctrine of the prejudices, first and foremost, makes the methodical use of reason possible. This is precisely why he interests us, for he expresses, albeit with a critical and exclusionary intention, elements in experience that are not teleologically related to the goal of science. For example, among the idle attributes, Bacon speaks of the tendency of the human mind always to remember what is positive and forget all instantia negativi. A case in point is the belief in oracles, which is based on this remarkable forgetfulness, which remembers only the true prophecies and forgets the false ones. Similarly, in Bacon's eyes, the relation of the human mind to the conventions of language is a case of knowledge being distracted by empty conventional forms. It is one of the idolaphori. These two examples are enough to indicate that the teleological aspect which dominates this question for Bacon is not the only one possible. Whether the positive should always have priority in the memory, or whether the tendency of life to forget the negative is to be criticized in all respects, is a question that needs asking. Ever since the Prometheus of Aeschylus, hope has been such a clear mark of human experience that, in view of its human importance, we must regard as one-sided the principle that experience should be evaluated only teleologically by the degree to which it ends in knowledge. We will probably come to a similar conclusion with regard to language, which precedes experience. And although illusory verbalistic problems can derive from the dominance of linguistic conventions, it is equally certain that language is at the same time a positive condition of, and guide to, experience itself. Even Husserl, like Bacon, noted more the negative than the positive side of language. In analyzing the concept of experience, we will not let ourselves be guided by these models, since we cannot confine ourselves to the teleological perspective, which until now has largely governed consideration of the problem. This is not to say that this perspective has not correctly grasped a true element in the structure of experience. The fact that experience is valid so long as it is not contradicted by new experience is clearly characteristic of the general nature of experience. Whether we are dealing with scientific procedure in the modern sense, or with the experience of daily life that men have always had. Thus, this characterization of experience is entirely in agreement with Aristotle's analysis of the concept of induction in the appendix to his posterior analytics. There, as in Chapter 1 of his Metaphysics, he describes how various perceptions unite to form the unity of experience when many individual perceptions are retained. What sort of unity is this? Clearly, it is the unity of a universal. But the universality of experience is not yet the universality of science. Rather, according to Aristotle, it occupies a remarkably indeterminate intermediate position between the many individual perceptions and the true universality of the concept. Science and technology start from the universality of the concept. But what is the universality of experience, and how does it evolve into the new universality of the logos? If experience shows us that a particular remedy has a particular effect, this means that something common has been noticed in a number of observations, and it is clear that the actual medical question, the scientific question, i.e., the question about the logos, is possible only on the basis of this kind of observation. Science knows why, for what reason, this remedy has a healing effect. Experience is not science itself, but it is a necessary condition of it. There must already be certainty, i.e., the individual observations must show the same regularity. Only when the universality found in experience has been attained can we look for the reason and hence begin a scientific inquiry. We ask again, what kind of universality is this? It is obviously concerned with the undifferentiated commonality of many single observations. It is because we retain these that we can make certain predictions. However, the relation among experience, retention, and the resulting unity of experience remains conspicuously vague. Aristotle is obviously basing what he says here on an argument that by his time already had a certain classic stamp. We find it first in Anaxagoras who, according to Plutarch, distinguished man from the beasts through his powers of empiria, mneme, sophia, and techne. We find a similar point in Aeschylus's emphasis on mneme in the Prometheus, and although we do not find the corresponding emphasis on mneme in Plato's myth in the Protagoras, both Plato and Aristotle indicate that it was already an established theory. The persistence of important perceptions is clearly the linking motif through which the knowledge of the universal can emerge from the experience of the individual. All animals that possess mneme in this sense, i.e., a sense of the past, of time, approximate the human in this respect. A separate investigation into this early theory of experience, whose traces we have outlined, would be necessary to discover how influential was the connection between memory, mneme, and language. It is clear that universal concepts are acquired by learning names and speech generally, and Themistius exemplified Aristotle's analysis of induction simply by reference to learning to speak and form words. At any rate, the universality of experience of which Aristotle speaks is not that of the concept or of science. The problematic which we approach with this theory is undoubtedly that of the sophists' educational thought, for we find in all the available documents a connection between that distinctiveness of the human that concerns us here and the general arrangement of nature. But this motif, the contrast of men and beasts, was the natural basis for the sophists' educational ideal. Experience is always actually present only in the individual observation. It is not known in a previous universality. Here lies the fundamental openness of experience to new experience, not only in the general sense that errors are corrected, but that experience is essentially dependent on constant confirmation and necessarily becomes a different kind of experience where there is no confirmation. Aristotle has a very fine image for the logic of this procedure. He compares the many observations someone makes to a fleeing army. They too hurry away, i.e., they do not stand fast. But if in this general flight an observation is confirmed by its being experienced repeatedly, then it does stand fast. At this point the general flight begins to stop. If others join it, then finally the whole fleeing host stops and again obeys a single command. The whole army under unified control is an image of science. The image is intended to show how science, i.e., universal truth, is possible, considering that it must not depend on the contingency of observations, but be valid in a really universal way. How is that possible on the basis of such contingent observations? The image is important for us because it illustrates the crucial element in the nature of experience. Like all images, it is not entirely perfect. However, the imperfection of a symbol is not a shortcoming, but the other side of the work of abstraction that it performs. Aristotle's image of the fleeing army is imperfect because it starts from the wrong assumption, namely that before fleeing, the army was standing fast. Of course, this is not true of the tenor, namely the way knowledge is born. But this very lack shows clearly the only thing that the image is intended to illustrate: the birth of experience as an event, over which no one has control, and which is not even determined by the particular weight of this or that observation, but in which everything is coordinated in a way that is ultimately incomprehensible. The image captures the curious openness in which experience is acquired, suddenly, through this or that feature unpredictably, and yet not without preparation, and it is valid from then on until there is a new experience, i.e., it holds not only for this or that instance, but everything of the kind. According to Aristotle, it is through this universality of experience that the true universality of the concept and the possibility of science comes about. Thus, the image illustrates the way the unprincipled universality of experience, its accretion, eventually leads to the unity of the archa, which means both command and principle. But if, like Aristotle, we think of the essence of experience only in regard to science, which in any case is not modern science but knowledge, then we are simplifying the process by which it comes about. His image describes this process, but it describes it under oversimplified conditions, as if one could automatically give a straightforward account of experience that contained no contradictions. Aristotle here presupposes that what persists in the flight of observations and emerges as a universal is, in fact, something common to them. For him, the universality of the concept is ontologically prior. What concerns Aristotle about experience is merely how it contributes to the formation of concepts. If we thus regard experience in terms of its result, we have ignored the fact that experience is a process. In fact, this process is essentially negative. It cannot be described simply as the unbroken generation of typical universals. Rather, this generation takes place as false generalizations are continually refuted by experience, and what was regarded as typical is shown not to be so. Language shows this when we use the word experience in two different senses: the experiences that conform to our expectation and confirm it, and the new experiences that occur to us. This latter, experience in the genuine sense, is always negative. If a new experience of an object occurs to us, this means that hitherto we have not seen the thing correctly, and now know it better. Thus, the negativity of experience has a curiously productive meaning. It is not simply that we see through a deception and hence make a correction, but we acquire a comprehensive knowledge. We cannot therefore have a new experience of any object at random, but it must be of such a nature that we gain better knowledge through it, not only of itself but of what we thought we knew before, i.e. of a universal. The negation by means of which it achieves this is a determinate negation. We call this kind of experience dialectical. It is not Aristotle, but most important, Hegel, who testifies to the dialectical element in experience. With him, the element of historicity comes into its own. He conceives experience as skepticism in action. We saw that one's experience changes one's whole knowledge. Strictly speaking, we cannot have the same experience twice. It is true, of course, that part of the nature of experience is to be continually confirmed. It is, as it were, acquired only by being repeated. But it is no longer a new experience when it is repeated and confirmed. When we have had an experience, this means that we possess it. We can now predict what was previously unexpected. The same thing cannot again become a new experience for us. Only something different and unexpected can provide someone who has experience with a new one. Thus, the experiencing consciousness has reversed its direction, i.e., it has turned back on itself. The experiencer has become aware of his experience. He is experienced. He has acquired a new horizon within which something can become an experience for him. This is the point at which Hegel becomes an important witness for us. In his Phenomenology of Mind, he shows how the consciousness that would be certain of itself has new experiences. For consciousness, its object is the in, itself. But what is in itself can be known only as it presents itself to the experiencing consciousness. Thus, the experiencing consciousness has precisely this experience, that the in itselfness of the object is in itself for us. Hegel here analyzes the concept of experience, an analysis that has drawn the special attention of Heidegger, who was both attracted and repulsed by it. Hegel says, "The dialectical movement that consciousness carries out in regard to itself, both in regard to its knowledge and to its object inasmuch as its new, true object emerges from this, is actually what is called experience." Remembering what we have said above, let us ask what Hegel means, since he is here clearly trying to say something about the general nature of experience. Heidegger has pointed out, rightly in my opinion, that here Hegel is not interpreting experience dialectically, but rather conceiving what is dialectical in terms of the nature of experience. According to Hegel, experience has the structure of a reversal of consciousness, and hence it is a dialectical movement. Hegel behaves, of course, as if what is generally meant by experience were something else, in that in general we experience the falsehood of this first concept through another object, and not in such a way that the object itself changes. But it is only apparently different. Actually, the philosophical mind realizes what the experiencing mind is really doing when it proceeds from one to the other. It is reversing itself. Thus, Hegel declares that the true nature of experience is to reverse itself in this way. In fact, as we saw, experience is initially always experience of negation. Something is not what we supposed it to be. In view of the experience that we have of another object, both things change, our knowledge and its object. We know better now, and that means that the object itself does not pass the test. The new object contains the truth about the old one. What Hegel thus describes as experience is the experience that consciousness has of itself. The principle of experience contains the infinitely important element that in order to accept a content as true, the man himself must be present, or more precisely, he must find such content in unity and combined with the certainty of himself, writes Hegel in the Encyclopedia. The concept of experience means precisely this, that this kind of unity with oneself is first established. This is the reversal that consciousness undergoes when it recognizes itself in what is alien and different. Whether experience moves by expanding into the manifoldness of the contents, or as the continual emergence of new forms of mind, the necessity of which is understood by philosophical science, in any case it is a reversal of consciousness. Hegel's dialectical description of experience has some truth. For Hegel, it is necessary, of course, that conscious experience should lead to a self-knowledge that no longer has anything other than or alien to itself. For him, the consummation of experience is science, the certainty of itself in knowledge. Hence his criterion of experience is self-knowledge. That is why the dialectic of experience must end in that overcoming of all experience which is attained in absolute knowledge, i.e. in the complete identity of consciousness and object. We can now understand why applying Hegel's dialectic to history, insofar as he regarded it as part of the absolute self-consciousness of philosophy, does not do justice to hermeneutical consciousness. The nature of experience is conceived in terms of something that surpasses it, for experience itself can never be science. Experience stands in an ineluctable opposition to knowledge and to the kind of instruction that follows from general theoretical or technical knowledge. The truth of experience always implies an orientation toward new experience. That is why a person who is called experienced has become so not only through experiences but is also open to new experiences. The consummation of his experience, the perfection that we call being experienced, does not consist in the fact that someone already knows everything and knows better than anyone else. Rather, the experienced person proves to be, on the contrary, someone who is radically undogmatic, who, because of the many experiences he has had and the knowledge he has drawn from them, is particularly well equipped to have new experiences and to learn from them. The dialectic of experience has its proper fulfillment, not in definitive knowledge, but in the openness to experience that is made possible by experience itself. But then this gives the concept of experience that we are concerned with here a qualitatively new element. It refers not only to experience in the sense of information about this or that. It refers to experience in general. This experience is always to be acquired, and from it no one can be exempt. Experience in this sense belongs to the historical nature of man. Although in bringing up children, for example, parents may try to spare them certain experiences. Experience as a whole is not something anyone can be spared. Rather, experience in this sense inevitably involves many disappointments of one's expectations, and only thus is experience acquired. That experience refers chiefly to painful and disagreeable experiences, does not mean that we are being especially pessimistic, but can be seen directly from its nature. Only through negative instances do we acquire new experiences, as Bacon saw. Every experience worthy of the name thwarts an expectation. Thus, the historical nature of man essentially implies a fundamental negativity that emerges in the relation between experience and insight. Insight is more than the knowledge of this or that situation. It always involves an escape from something that had deceived us and held us captive. Thus, insight always involves an element of self-knowledge and constitutes a necessary side of what we called experience in the proper sense. Insight is something we come to. It too is ultimately part of the vocation of man, i.e., to be discerning and insightful. If we want to quote another witness for this third element in the nature of experience, the best is Aeschylus. He found the formula, or rather recognized its metaphysical significance as expressing the inner historicality of experience, of learning though suffering. This phrase does not mean only that we become wise through suffering, and that our knowledge of things must first be corrected through deception and undeception. Understood in this way, the formula is probably as old as human experience itself. But Aeschylus means more than this. He refers to the reason why this is so. What a man has to learn through suffering is not this or that particular thing, but insight into the limitations of humanity, into the absoluteness of the barrier that separates man from the divine. It is ultimately a religious insight, the kind of insight that gave birth to Greek tragedy. Thus, experience is experience of human finitude. The truly experienced person is one who has taken this to heart, who knows that he is master neither of time nor the future. The experienced man knows that all foresight is limited and all plans uncertain. In him is realized the truth value of experience. If it is characteristic of every phase of the process of experience that the experienced person acquires a new openness to new experiences, this is certainly true of the idea of being perfectly experienced. It does not mean that experience has ceased and a higher form of knowledge is reached, Hegel, but that for the first time experience fully and truly is. In it all dogmatism, which proceeds from the soaring desires of the human heart, reaches an absolute barrier. Experience teaches us to acknowledge the real. The genuine result of experience, then, as of all desire to know, is to know what is. But what is here is not this or that thing, but what cannot be destroyed. Real experience is that whereby man becomes aware of his finiteness. In it are discovered the limits of the power and the self-knowledge of his planning reason. The idea that everything can be reversed, that there is always time for everything and that everything somehow returns, proves to be an illusion. Rather, the person who is situated and acts in history continually experiences the fact that nothing returns. To acknowledge what is does not just mean to recognize what is at this moment, but to have insight into the limited degree to which the future is still open to expectation and planning, or, even more fundamentally, to have the insight that all the expectation and planning of finite beings is finite and limited. Genuine experience is experience of one's own historicity. Our discussion of the concept of experience thus arrives at a conclusion that is of considerable importance to our inquiry into the nature of historically affected consciousness. As a genuine form of experience, it must reflect the general structure of experience. Thus, we will have to seek out in hermeneutical experience those elements that we have found in our analysis of experience in general. Hermeneutical experience is concerned with tradition. This is what is to be experienced. But tradition is not simply a process that experience teaches us to know and govern. It is language, i.e., it expresses itself like a thou. A thou is not an object. It relates itself to us. It would be wrong to think that this means that what is experienced in tradition is to be taken as the opinion of another person, a thou. Rather, I maintain that the understanding of tradition does not take the traditionary text as an expression of another person's life, but as meaning that is detached from the person who means it, from an I or a thou. Still, the relationship to the thou and the meaning of experience implicit in that relation must be capable of teaching us something about hermeneutical experience. For tradition is a genuine partner in dialogue, and we belong to it, as does the I with a thou. It is clear that the experience of the thou must be special, because the thou is not an object, but is in relationship with us. For this reason, the elements we have emphasized in the structure of experience will undergo a change. Since here the object of experience is a person, this kind of experience is a moral phenomenon, as is the knowledge acquired through experience, the understanding of the other person. Let us therefore consider the change that occurs in the structure of experience when it is experience of the thou, and when it is hermeneutical experience. There is a kind of experience of the thou that tries to discover typical behavior in one's fellow men, and can make predictions about others on the basis of experience. We call this a knowledge of human nature. We understand the other person in the same way that we understand any other typical event in our experiential field, i.e., he is predictable. His behavior is as much a means to our end as any other means. From the moral point of view, this orientation toward the thou is purely self-regarding and contradicts the moral definition of man. As we know, in interpreting the categorical imperative, Kant said, inter alia, that the other should never be used as a means but always as an end in himself. If we relate this form of the I-thou relation, the kind of understanding of the thou that constitutes knowledge of human nature, to the hermeneutical problem, the equivalent is naive faith in method and in the objectivity that can be attained through it. Someone who understands tradition in this way makes it an object, i.e., he confronts it in a free and uninvolved way, and by methodically excluding everything subjective, he discovers what it contains. We saw that he thereby detaches himself from the continuing effect of the tradition in which he himself has his historical reality. It is the method of the social sciences, following the methodological ideas of the 18th century and their programmatic formulation by Hume. Ideas that are a cliched version of scientific method. But this covers only part of the actual procedure of the human sciences, and even that is schematically reduced, since it recognizes only what is typical and regular in behavior. It flattens out the nature of hermeneutical experience in precisely the same way as we have seen in the teleological interpretation of the concept of induction since Aristotle. A second way in which the thou is experienced and understood is that the thou is acknowledged as a person. But despite this acknowledgement, the understanding of the thou is still a form of self-relatedness. Such self-regard derives from the dialectical appearance that the dialectic of the I-thou relation brings with it. This relation is not immediate but reflective. To every claim, there is a counterclaim. This is why it is possible for each of the partners in the relationship reflectively to outdo the other. One claims to know the other's claim from his point of view, and even to understand the other better than the other understands himself. In this way, the thou loses the immediacy with which it makes its claim. It is understood, but this means it is co-opted and preempted reflectively from the standpoint of the other person. Because it is a mutual relationship, it helps to constitute the reality of the I-thou relationship itself. The inner historicity of all the relations in the lives of men consist in the fact that there is a constant struggle for mutual recognition. This can have very varied degrees of tension, to the point of the complete domination of one person by the other. But even the most extreme forms of mastery and slavery are a genuine dialectical relationship of the kind that Hegel has elaborated. The experience of the thou attained here is more adequate than what we have called the knowledge of human nature, which merely seeks to calculate how the other person will behave. It is an illusion to see another person as a tool that can be absolutely known and used. Even a slave still has a will to power that turns against his master, as Nietzsche rightly said. But the dialectic of reciprocity that governs all I-thou relationships is inevitably hidden from the consciousness of the individual. The servant who tyrannizes his master by serving him does not believe that he is serving his own aims by doing so. In fact, his own self-consciousness consists precisely in withdrawing from the dialectic of this reciprocity, in reflecting himself out of his relation to the other, and so becoming unreachable by him. By understanding the other, by claiming to know him, one robs his claims of their legitimacy. In particular, the dialectic of charitable or welfare work operates in this way, penetrating all relationships between men as a reflective form of the effort to dominate. The claim to understand the other person in advance functions to keep the other person's claim at a distance. We are familiar with this from the teacher-pupil relationship, an authoritative form of welfare work. In these reflective forms, the dialectic of the I-thou relation becomes more clearly defined. In the hermeneutical sphere, the parallel to this experience of the thou is what we generally call historical consciousness. Historical consciousness knows about the otherness of the other, about the past in its otherness, just as the understanding of the thou knows the thou as a person. In the otherness of the past, it seeks not the instantiation of a general law, but something historically unique. By claiming to transcend its own conditionedness completely in knowing the other, it is involved in a false dialectical appearance, since it is actually seeking to master the past, as it were. This need not be accompanied by the speculative claim of a philosophy of world history. As an ideal of perfect enlightenment, it sheds light on the process of experience in the historical sciences, as we find, for example, in Dilthey. In my analysis of hermeneutical consciousness, I have shown that the dialectical illusion which historical consciousness creates, and which corresponds to the dialectical illusion of experience perfected and replaced by knowledge, is the unattainable ideal of the Enlightenment. A person who believes he is free of prejudices, relying on the objectivity of his procedures, and denying that he is himself conditioned by historical circumstances, experiences the power of the prejudices that unconsciously dominate him as an unseen driving force. A person who does not admit that he is dominated by prejudices will fail to see what manifests itself by their light. It is like the relation between I and thou. A person who reflects himself out of the mutuality of such a relation changes this relationship and destroys its moral bond. A person who reflects himself out of a living relationship to tradition destroys the true meaning of this tradition in exactly the same way. In seeking to understand tradition, historical consciousness must not rely on the critical method with which it approaches its sources, as if this preserved it from mixing in its own judgments and prejudices. It must, in fact, think within its own historicity. To be situated within a tradition does not limit the freedom of knowledge, but makes it possible. Knowing and recognizing this constitutes the third and highest type of hermeneutical experience, the openness to tradition, characteristic of historically affected consciousness. It too has a real analog in the I's experience of the thou. In human relations, the important thing is, as we have seen, to experience the thou truly as a thou, i.e., not to overlook his claim, but to let him really say something to us. Here is where openness belongs. But ultimately, this openness does not exist only for the person who speaks. Rather, anyone who listens is fundamentally open. Without such openness to one another, there is no genuine human bond. Belonging together always also means being able to listen to one another. When two people understand each other, this does not mean that one person understands the other. Similarly, to hear and obey someone does not mean simply that we do blindly what the other desires. We call such a person slavish. Openness to the other, then, involves recognizing that I myself must accept some things that are against me, even though no one else forces me to do so. This is the parallel to the hermeneutical experience. I must allow tradition's claim to validity, not in the sense of simply acknowledging the past in its otherness, but in such a way that it has something to say to me. This too calls for a fundamental sort of openness. Someone who is open to tradition in this way sees that historical consciousness is not really open at all, but rather, when it reads its texts, historically, it has always thoroughly smoothed them out beforehand, so that the criteria of the historian's own knowledge can never be called into question by tradition. Recall the naive mode of comparison that the commonplace is that everything that is really great, good, and beautiful is improbable, for it is extraordinary, or at least suspicious. The axiom of familiarity is that things must always have been just as they are for us, for things are naturally like this. By contrast, historically affected consciousness rises above such naive comparisons and assimilations by letting itself experience tradition and by keeping itself open to the truth claim encountered in it. The hermeneutical consciousness culminates not in methodological sureness of itself, but in the same readiness for experience that distinguishes the experienced man from the man captivated by dogma. As we can now say more exactly in terms of the concept of experience, this readiness is what distinguishes historically affected consciousness. The hermeneutic priority of the question. The model of Platonic dialectic. This indicates the direction our inquiry must take. We will now examine the logical structure of openness that characterizes hermeneutical consciousness, recalling the importance of the concept of the question to our analysis of the hermeneutical situation. It is clear that the structure of the question is implicit in all experience. We cannot have experiences without asking questions. Recognizing that an object is different, and not as we first thought, obviously presupposes the question whether it was this or that. From a logical point of view, the openness essential to experience is precisely the openness of being either this or that. It has the structure of a question. And just as the dialectical negativity of experience culminates in the idea of being perfectly experienced, i.e., being aware of our finitude and limitedness, so also the logical form of the question and the negativity that is part of it culminate in a radical negativity, the knowledge of not knowing. This is the famous Socratic doctrine of ignorance which, amid the most extreme negativity of doubt, opens up the way to the true superiority of questioning. We will have to consider the essence of the question in greater depth if we are to clarify the particular nature of hermeneutical experience. The essence of the question is to have sense. Now, sense involves a sense of direction. Hence, the sense of the question is the only direction from which the answer can be given, if it is to make sense. A question places what is questioned in a particular perspective. When a question arises, it breaks open the being of the object, as it were. Hence, the logos that explicates this opened-up being is an answer. Its sense lies in the sense of the question. Among the greatest insights that Plato's account of Socrates affords us is that, contrary to the general opinion, it is more difficult to ask questions than to answer them. When the partners in the Socratic dialogue are unable to answer Socrates' awkward questions and try to turn the tables by assuming what they suppose is the preferable role of the questioner, they come to grief. Behind this comic motif in the Platonic dialogues, there is the critical distinction between authentic and inauthentic dialogue. To someone who engages in dialogue only to prove himself right and not to gain insight, asking questions will indeed seem easier than answering them. There is no risk that he will be unable to answer a question. In fact, however, the continual failure of the interlocutor shows that people who think they know better cannot even ask the right questions. In order to be able to ask, one must want to know, and that means knowing that one does not know. In the comic confusion between question and answer, knowledge and ignorance that Plato describes, there is a profound recognition of the priority of the question in all knowledge and discourse that really reveals something of an object. Discourse that is intended to reveal something requires that that thing be broken open by the question. For this reason, dialectic proceeds by way of question and answer, or rather, the path of all knowledge leads through the question. To ask a question means to bring into the open. The openness of what is in question consists in the fact that the answer is not settled. It must still be undetermined, awaiting a decisive answer. The significance of questioning consists in revealing the questionability of what is questioned. It has to be brought into this state of indeterminacy, so that there is an equilibrium between pro and contra. The sense of every question is realized in passing through this state of indeterminacy, in which it becomes an open question. Every true question requires this openness. Without it, it is basically no more than an apparent question. We are familiar with this from the example of the pedagogical question, whose paradoxical difficulty consists in the fact that it is a question without a questioner. Or from the rhetorical question, which not only has no questioner but no object. The openness of a question is not boundless. It is limited by the horizon of the question. A question that lacks this horizon is, so to speak, floating. It becomes a question only when its fluid indeterminacy is concretized in a specific this or that. In other words, the question has to be posed. Posing a question implies openness, but also limitation. It implies the explicit establishing of presuppositions, in terms of which can be seen what still remains open. Hence, a question can be asked rightly or wrongly, according as it reaches into the sphere of the truly open, or fails to do so. We say that a question has been put wrongly when it does not reach the state of openness but precludes reaching it by retaining false presuppositions. It pretends to an openness and susceptibility to decision that it does not have. But if what is in question is not foregrounded, or not correctly foregrounded, from those presuppositions that are really held, then it is not brought into the open, and nothing can be decided. This is shown clearly in the case of the slanted question that we are so familiar with in everyday life. There can be no answer to a slanted question, because it leads us only apparently, and not really, through the open state of indeterminacy in which a decision is made. We call it slanted rather than wrongly put because there is a question behind it, i.e., there is an openness intended, but it does not lie in the direction in which the slanted question is pointing. The word slanted refers to something that is deviated from the right direction. The slant of a question consists in the fact that it does not give any real direction, and hence no answer to it is possible. Similarly, we say that statements which are not exactly wrong but also not right are slanted. This too is determined by their sense, i.e., by their relation to the question. We cannot call them wrong, since we detect something true about them. But neither can we properly call them right, because they do not correspond to any meaningful question, and hence have no correct meaning, unless they are themselves corrected. Sense is always sense of direction for a possible question. Correct sense must accord with the direction in which a question points. Insofar as a question remains open, it always includes both negative and positive judgments. This is the basis of the essential relation between question and knowledge. For it is the essence of knowledge not only to judge something correctly, but at the same time and for the same reason, to exclude what is wrong. Deciding the question is the path to knowledge. What decides a question is the preponderance of reasons for the one and against the other possibility. But this is still not full knowledge. The thing itself is known only when the counter-instances are dissolved, only when the counter-arguments are seen to be incorrect. We are familiar with this especially from medieval dialectic, which lists not only the pro and contra, and then its own decision, but finally sets out all the arguments. This form of medieval dialectic is not simply the consequence of an educational system emphasizing disputation, but on the contrary, it depends on the interconnection between knowledge and dialectic, i.e., between answer and question. There is a famous passage in Aristotle's Metaphysics that has attracted a great deal of attention and can be explained in terms of what we have been saying. Aristotle says that dialectic is the power to investigate contraries independently of the object, and to see whether one and the same science can be concerned with contraries. Here it seems that a general account of dialectic, which corresponds exactly to what we find, for example, in Plato's Parmenides, is linked to a highly specialized logical problem, which is familiar to us from the topics. It does indeed seem a very curious question whether the same science can be concerned with contraries. Hence the attempt has been made to dismiss this as a gloss. The connection between the two questions becomes clear, however, as soon as we accept the priority of the question over the answer, which is the basis of the concept of knowledge. Knowledge always means precisely considering opposites. Its superiority over preconceived opinion consists in the fact that it is able to conceive of possibilities as possibilities. Knowledge is dialectical from the ground up. Only a person who has questions can have knowledge, but questions include the antithesis of yes and no, of being like this and being like that. Only because knowledge is dialectical in this comprehensive sense can there be a dialectic that explicitly makes its object the antithesis of yes and no. Thus, the apparently over-specialized question of whether or not it is possible to have one and the same science of contraries contains, in fact, the ground of the very possibility of dialectic. Even Aristotle's views on proof and argument, which in fact make dialectic a subordinate element in knowledge, accord the same priority to the question, as has been demonstrated by Ernst Kapp's brilliant work on the origin of Aristotle's syllogistic. The priority of the question in knowledge shows how fundamentally the idea of method is limited for knowledge, which has been the starting point for our argument as a whole. There is no such thing as a method of learning to ask questions, of learning to see what is questionable. On the contrary, the example of Socrates teaches that the important thing is the knowledge that one does not know. Hence the Socratic dialectic, which leads through its art of confusing the interlocutor to this knowledge, creates the conditions for the question. All questioning and desire to know presuppose a knowledge that one does not know. So much so indeed that a particular lack of knowledge leads to a particular question. Plato shows in an unforgettable way where the difficulty lies in knowing what one does not know. It is the power of opinion against which it is so hard to obtain an admission of ignorance. It is opinion that suppresses questions. Opinion has a curious tendency to propagate itself. It would always like to be the general opinion, just as the word that the Greeks have for opinion, doxa, also means the decision made by the majority in the council assembly. How then can ignorance be admitted and questions arise? Let us say first of all that it can occur only in the way any idea occurs to us. It is true that we do speak of ideas occurring to us less in regard to questions than to answers, e.g., the solution of problems. And by this we mean to say that there is no methodical way to arrive at the solution. But we also know that such ideas do not occur to us entirely unexpectedly. They always presuppose an orientation toward an area of openness from which the idea can occur, i.e., they presuppose questions. The real nature of the sudden idea is perhaps less that a solution occurs to us like an answer to a riddle than that a question occurs to us that breaks through into the open and thereby makes an answer possible. Every sudden idea has the structure of a question, but the sudden occurrence of the question is already a breach in the smooth front of popular opinion. Hence, we say that a question too occurs to us, that it arises or presents itself. More than that, we raise it or present it. We have already seen that logically considered, the negativity of experience implies a question. In fact, we have experiences when we are shocked by things that do not accord with our expectations. Thus, questioning too is more a passion than an action. A question presses itself on us. We can no longer avoid it and persist in our accustomed opinion. It seems to conflict with these conclusions, however, that the Socratic Platonic dialectic raises the art of questioning to a conscious art. But there is something peculiar about this art. We have seen that it is reserved to the person who wants to know, i.e., who already has questions. The art of questioning is not the art of resisting the pressure of opinion. It already presupposes this freedom. It is not an art in the sense that the Greeks speak of techne, not a craft that can be taught, or by means of which we could master the discovery of truth. The so-called epistemological digression of the seventh letter is directed, rather, to distinguishing the unique art of dialectic from everything that can be taught and learned. The art of dialectic is not the art of being able to win every argument. On the contrary, it is possible that someone practicing the art of dialectic, i.e., the art of questioning and of seeking truth, comes off worse in the argument in the eyes of those listening to it. As the art of asking questions, dialectic proves its value because only the person who knows how to ask questions is able to persist in his questioning, which involves being able to preserve his orientation toward openness. The art of questioning is the art of questioning ever further, i.e., the art of thinking. It is called dialectic because it is the art of conducting a real dialogue. To conduct a dialogue requires, first of all, that the partners do not talk at cross purposes. Hence, it necessarily has the structure of question and answer. The first condition of the art of conversation is ensuring that the other person is with us. We know this only too well from the reiterated yes of the interlocutors in the Platonic dialogues. The positive side of this monotony is the inner logic with which the subject matter is developed in the conversation. To conduct a conversation means to allow oneself to be conducted by the subject matter to which the partners in the dialogue are oriented. It requires that one does not try to argue the other person down, but that one really considers the weight of the other's opinion. Hence, it is an art of testing. But the art of testing is the art of questioning. For we have seen that to question means to lay open, to place in the open. As against the fixity of opinions, questioning makes the object and all its possibilities fluid. A person skilled in the art of questioning is a person who can prevent questions from being suppressed by the dominant opinion. A person who possesses this art will himself search for everything in favor of an opinion. Dialectic consists not in trying to discover the weakness of what is said, but in bringing out its real strength. It is not the art of arguing, which can make a strong case out of a weak one, but the art of thinking, which can strengthen objections by referring to the subject matter. The unique and continuing relevance of the Platonic dialogues is due to this art of strengthening, for in this process, what is said is continually transformed into the uttermost possibilities of its rightness and truth, and overcomes all opposition that tries to limit its validity. Here again, it is not simply a matter of leaving the subject undecided. Someone who wants to know something cannot just leave it a matter of mere opinion, which is to say that he cannot hold himself aloof from the opinions that are in question. The speaker is put to the question until the truth of what is under discussion finally emerges. The hermeneutic productivity of the Socratic dialogue, the art of using words as a midwife, is certainly directed toward the people who are the partners in the dialogue, but it is concerned merely with the opinions they express, the immanent logic of the subject matter that is unfolded in the dialogue. What emerges in its truth is the logos, which is neither mine nor yours, and hence so far transcends the interlocutor's subjective opinions that even the person leading the conversation knows that he does not know. As the art of conducting a conversation, dialectic is also the art of seeing things in the unity of an aspect, i.e., it is the art of forming concepts through working out the common meaning. What characterizes a dialogue, in contrast with the rigid form of statements that demand to be set down in writing, is precisely this: that in dialogue spoken language, in the process of question and answer, giving and taking, talking at cross purposes and seeing each other's point, performs the communication of meaning that, with respect to the written tradition, is the task of hermeneutics. Hence it is more than a metaphor, it is a memory of what originally was the case, to describe the task of hermeneutics as entering into dialogue with the text. That this interpretation is performed by spoken language does not mean that it is transposed into a foreign medium. Rather, being transformed into spoken language represents the restoration of the original communication of meaning. When it is interpreted, written tradition is brought back out of the alienation in which it finds itself and into the living present of conversation, which is always fundamentally realized in question and answer. Thus, we can appeal to Plato if we want to foreground the place of the question in hermeneutics. We can do this all the more readily since Plato himself manifests the hermeneutical phenomenon in a specific way. It would be worth investigating his critique of the written word as evidence that the poetic and philosophical tradition was becoming a literature in Athens. In Plato's dialogues, we see how the kind of textual interpretation cultivated by the sophists, especially the interpretation of poetry for didactic ends, elicited Plato's opposition. We can see further how Plato tries to overcome the weakness of the logoi, especially the written logoi, through his own dialogues. The literary form of the dialogue places language and concept back within the original movement of the conversation. This protects words from all dogmatic abuse. The primacy of conversation can also be seen in derivative forms in which the relation between question and answer is obscured. Letters, for example, are an interesting intermediate phenomenon, a kind of written conversation that, as it were, stretches out the movement of talking at cross purposes and seeing each other's point. The art of writing letters consists in not letting what one says become a treatise on the subject, but in making it acceptable to the correspondent. But on the other hand, it also consists in preserving and fulfilling the standard of finality that everything stated in writing has. The time lapse between sending a letter and receiving an answer is not just an external factor, but gives this form of communication its special nature as a particular form of writing. So we note that speeding up the post has not improved this form of communication, but on the contrary, has led to a decline in the art of letter writing. The primacy of dialogue, the relation of question and answer, can be seen in even so extreme a case as that of Hegel's dialectic as a philosophical method. To elaborate the totality of the determinations of thought, which was the aim of Hegel's logic, is as it were the attempt to comprehend within the great monologue of modern method the continuum of meaning that is realized in every particular instance of dialogue. When Hegel sets himself the task of making the abstract determinations of thought fluid and subtle, this means dissolving and remolding logic into concrete language and transforming the concept into the meaningful power of the word that questions and answers. A magnificent reminder, even if unsuccessful, of what dialectic really was and is. Hegel's dialectic is a monologue of thinking that tries to carry out in advance what matures little by little in every genuine dialogue. The logic of question and answer. Thus we return to the conclusion that the hermeneutic phenomenon too implies the primacy of dialogue and the structure of question and answer. That a historical text is made the object of interpretation means that it puts a question to the interpreter. Thus, interpretation always involves a relation to the question that is asked of the interpreter. To understand a text means to understand this question. But this takes place, as we showed, by our attaining the hermeneutical horizon. We now recognize this as the horizon of the question within which the sense of the text is determined. Thus, a person who wants to understand must question what lies behind what is said. He must understand it as an answer to a question. If we go back behind what is said, then we inevitably ask questions beyond what is said. We understand the sense of the text only by acquiring the horizon of the question, a horizon that, as such, necessarily includes other possible answers. Thus, the meaning of a sentence is relative to the question to which it is a reply, but that implies that its meaning necessarily exceeds what is said in it. As these considerations show, then the logic of the human sciences is a logic of the question. Despite Plato, we are not very ready for such a logic. Almost the only person I find a link with here is R.G. Collingwood. In a brilliant and telling critique of the Oxford realist school, he developed the idea of a logic of question and answer, but unfortunately never elaborated it systematically. He clearly saw what was missing in naive hermeneutics founded on the prevailing philosophical critique. In particular, the practice that Collingwood found in English universities of discussing statements, though perhaps good practice for sharpening one's intelligence, obviously failed to take account of the historicity that is part of all understanding. Collingwood argues thus: we can understand a text only when we have understood the question to which it is an answer. But since this question can be derived solely from the text, and accordingly the appropriateness of the reply is the methodological presupposition for the reconstruction of the question, any criticism of this reply from some other quarter is pure shadowboxing. It is like understanding works of art. A work of art can be understood only if we assume its adequacy as an expression of the artistic idea. Here, too, we have to discover the question which it answers, if we are to understand it as an answer. This is, in fact, an axiom of all hermeneutics. We described it above as the foreconception of completeness. For Collingwood, this is the nerve of all historical knowledge. The historical method requires that the logic of question and answer be applied to historical tradition. We will understand historical events only if we reconstruct the question to which the historical actions of the persons involved were the answer. As an example, Collingwood cites the Battle of Trafalgar and Nelson's plan on which it was based. The example is intended to show that the course of the battle helps us to understand Nelson's real plan, because it was successfully carried out. Because his opponent's plan failed, however, it cannot be reconstructed from the events. Thus, understanding the course of the battle and understanding the plan that Nelson carried out in it are one and the same process. But yet one cannot conceal the fact that the logic of question and answer has to reconstruct two different questions that have two different answers. The question of the meaning of a great event and the question of whether this event went according to plan. Clearly, the two questions coincide only when the plan coincides with the course of events. But we cannot suppose such coincidence as a methodological principle when we are concerned with a historical tradition which deals with men, like ourselves, in history. Tolstoy's celebrated description of the council of war before the battle, in which all the strategic possibilities are calculated and all the plans considered, thoroughly and perceptively, while the general sits there and sleeps, but in the night before the battle goes round all the sentry posts, is obviously a more accurate account of what we call history. Kutuzov gets nearer to the reality and the forces that determine it than the strategists of the War Council. The conclusion to be drawn from this example is that the interpreter of history always runs the risk of hypostasizing the connectedness of events when he regards their significance as that intended by the actual actors and planners. This is a legitimate undertaking only if Hegel's conditions hold good, i.e., the philosophy of history is made party to the plans of the world spirit, and on the basis of this esoteric knowledge is able to mark out certain individuals as having world historical importance, since there is a real correlation between their particular ideas and the world historical meaning of events. But it is impossible to derive a hermeneutical principle for the knowledge of history from such conjunctions of the subjective and objective in history. In regard to historical tradition, Hegel's theory clearly has only a limited truth. The infinite web of motivations that constitutes history only occasionally and briefly acquires the clarity of what a single individual has planned. Thus, what Hegel describes as an exception proves the rule that there is a disproportion between an individual's subjective thoughts and the meaning of the whole course of history. As a rule, we experience the course of events as something that continually changes our plans and expectations. Someone who tries to stick to his plans discovers precisely how powerless his reason is. There are rare occasions when everything happens, as it were, of its own accord, i.e., events seem to be automatically in accord with our plans and wishes. On these occasions, we can say that everything is going according to plan. But to apply this experience to the whole of history is to make a great extrapolation that completely contradicts our experience. Collingwood's use of the logic of question and answer in hermeneutical theory is made ambiguous by this extrapolation. Our understanding of written tradition per se is not such that we can simply presuppose that the meaning we discover in it agrees with what its author intended. just as the events of history do not in general manifest any agreement with the subjective ideas of the person who stands and acts within history, so the sense of a text in general reaches far beyond what its author originally intended. The task of understanding is concerned above all with the meaning of the text itself. This is clearly what Collingwood had in mind when he denied that there is any difference between the historical question and the philosophical question to which the text is supposed to be an answer. Nevertheless, we must remember that the question we are concerned to reconstruct has to do not with the mental experiences of the author, but simply with the meaning of the text itself. Thus, if we have understood the meaning of a sentence, i.e., have reconstructed the question to which it really is the answer, it must be possible to inquire also about the questioner and his intended question, to which the text is perhaps only an imagined answer. Collingwood is wrong when he finds it methodologically unsound to differentiate between the question which the text is intended to answer and the question to which it really is an answer. He is right only insofar as understanding a text does not generally involve such a distinction, if we are concerned with the subject matter of which the text speaks. Reconstructing the author's ideas is quite a different task. We will have to ask what conditions apply to this different task. For it is undoubtedly true that compared with the genuine hermeneutical experience that understands the meaning of the text, reconstructing what the author really had in mind is a limited undertaking. Historicism tempts us to regard such reduction as a scientific virtue and to regard understanding as a kind of reconstruction which in effect repeats the process whereby the text came into being. Hence it follows the cognitive ideal familiar to us from the knowledge of nature, where we understand a process only when we are able to reproduce it artificially. I have shown above how questionable is Vico's statement that this ideal finds its purest culmination in history, because there man encounters his own human historical reality. I have asserted, on the contrary, that every historian and philologist must reckon with the fundamental non-definitiveness of the horizon in which his understanding moves. Historical tradition can be understood only as something always in the process of being defined by the course of events. Similarly, the philologist dealing with poetic or philosophical texts knows that they are inexhaustible. In both cases, it is the course of events that brings out new aspects of meaning in historical material. By being reactualized in understanding, texts are drawn into a genuine course of events in exactly the same way as are events themselves. This is what we described as the history of effect, as an element in hermeneutical experience. Every actualization in understanding can be regarded as a historical potential of what is understood. It is part of the historical finitude of our being that we are aware that others after us will understand in a different way. And yet it is equally indubitable that it remains the same work whose fullness of meaning is realized in the changing process of understanding, just as it is the same history whose meaning is constantly in the process of being defined. The hermeneutical reduction to the author's meaning is just as inappropriate as the reduction of historical events to the intentions of their protagonists. However, we cannot take the reconstruction of the question to which a given text is an answer simply as an achievement of historical method. The most important thing is the question that the text puts to us, our being perplexed by the traditionary word, so that understanding it must already include the task of the historical self-mediation between the present and tradition. Thus, the relation of question and answer is, in fact, reversed. The voice that speaks to us from the past, whether text, work, trace, itself poses a question and places our meaning in openness. In order to answer the question put to us, we, the interrogated, must ourselves begin to ask questions. We must attempt to reconstruct the question to which the traditionary text is the answer. But we will be unable to do so without going beyond the historical horizon it presents us. Reconstructing the question to which the text is presumed to be the answer itself takes place within a process of questioning through which we try to answer the question that the text asks us. A reconstructed question can never stand within its original horizon, for the historical horizon that circumscribed the reconstruction is not a truly comprehensive one. It is, rather, included within the horizon that embraces us as the questioners who have been encountered by the traditionary word. Hence it is a hermeneutical necessity always to go beyond mere reconstruction. We cannot avoid thinking about what the author accepted unquestioningly, and hence did not consider, and bringing it into the openness of the question. This is not to open the door to arbitrariness in interpretation, but to reveal what always takes place. Understanding the word of tradition always requires that the reconstructed question be set within the openness of its question-ableness, i.e., that it merge with the question that tradition is for us. If the historical question emerges by itself, this means that it no longer arises as a question. It results from the cessation of understanding, a detour in which we get stuck. Part of real understanding, however, is that we regain the concepts of a historical past in such a way that they also include our own comprehension of them. Above, I called this the fusion of horizons. With Collingwood, we can say that we understand only when we understand the question to which something is the answer, but the intention of what is understood in this way does not remain foregrounded against our own intention. Rather, reconstructing the question to which the meaning of a text is understood as an answer merges with our own questioning. For the text must be understood as an answer to a real question. The close relation between questioning and understanding is what gives the hermeneutic experience its true dimension. However much a person trying to understand may leave open the truth of what is said, however much he may dismiss the immediate meaning of the object, and consider its deeper significance instead, and take the latter not as true, but merely as meaningful, so that the possibility of its truth remains unsettled. This is the real and fundamental nature of a question, namely to make things indeterminate. Questions always bring out the undetermined possibilities of a thing. That is why we cannot understand the question-ableness of something without asking real questions, though we can understand a meaning without meaning it. To understand the question-ableness of something is already to be questioning. There can be no tentative or potential attitude to questioning, for questioning is not the positing, but the testing of possibilities. Here, the nature of questioning indicates what is demonstrated by the actual operation of the Platonic dialogue. A person who thinks must ask himself questions. Even when a person says that such and such a question might arise, this is already a real questioning that simply masks itself, out of either caution or politeness. This is the reason why understanding is always more than merely recreating someone else's meaning. Questioning opens up possibilities of meaning, and thus what is meaningful passes into one's own thinking on the subject. Only in an inauthentic sense can we talk about understanding questions that one does not pose oneself, e.g., questions that are outdated or empty. We understand how certain questions came to be asked in particular historical circumstances. Understanding such questions means, then, understanding the particular presuppositions whose demise makes such questions dead. An example is perpetual motion. The horizon of meaning of such questions is only apparently still open. They are no longer understood as questions. For what we understand, in such cases, is precisely that there is no question. To understand a question means to ask it. To understand meaning is to understand it as the answer to a question. The logic of question and answer that Collingwood elaborated puts an end to talk about permanent problems, as in the way the Oxford realists approach to the classics of philosophy, and hence also an end to the concept of history of problems developed by Neo-Kantianism. History of problems would truly be history only if it acknowledged that the identity of the problem is an empty abstraction and permitted itself to be transformed into questioning. There is no such thing, in fact, as a point outside history from which the identity of a problem can be conceived within the vicissitudes of the history of attempts to solve it. The fact is that understanding philosophical texts always requires recognizing what is cognized in them. Without this, we would understand nothing at all, but this in no way means that we step outside the historical conditions in which we are situated and in which we understand. The problem that we recognize is not in fact simply the same if it is to be understood in a genuine act of questioning. We can regard it as the same only because of our historical short-sightedness. The standpoint that is beyond any standpoint, a standpoint from which we could conceive its true identity, is a pure illusion. We can understand the reason for this now. The concept of the problem is clearly an abstraction, namely the detachment of the content of the question from the question that in fact first reveals it. It refers to the abstract schema to which real and really motivated questions can be reduced and under which they can be subsumed. Such a problem has fallen out of the motivated context of questioning, from which it receives the clarity of its sense. Hence it is insoluble like every question that has no clear, unambiguous sense, because it is not really motivated and asked. This also confirms the origin of the concept of the problem. It does not belong in the sphere of those honestly motivated refutations in which the truth of the subject matter is advanced, but in the sphere of dialectic as a weapon to amaze or make a fool of one's opponent. In Aristotle, the word problema refers to those questions that present themselves as open alternatives because there is evidence for both views, and we think that they cannot be decided by reasons, since the questions involved are too great. Problems are not real questions that arise of themselves, and hence acquire the pattern of their answer from the genesis of their meaning, but are alternatives that can only be accepted as themselves, and thus can be treated only in a dialectical way. This dialectical sense of the problem has its proper place in rhetoric, not in philosophy. Part of the concept of the problem is that there can be no clear decision on the basis of reasons. That is why Kant sees the rise of the concept of the problem as limited to the dialectic of pure reason. Problems are tasks that emerge entirely from its own womb, i.e., products of reason itself, the complete solution of which it cannot hope to achieve. It is interesting that in the 19th century, with the collapse of the unbroken tradition of philosophical questioning and the rise of historicism, the concept of the problem acquires a universal validity, a sign of the fact that an immediate relation to the questions of philosophy no longer exists. It is typical of the embarrassment of philosophical consciousness when faced with historicism that it took flight into an abstraction, the concept of the problem, and saw no problem about the manner in which problems actually exist. Neo-Kantian history of problems is a bastard of historicism, critiquing the concept of the problem by appealing to a logic of question and answer must destroy the illusion that problems exist like stars in the sky. Reflection on the hermeneutical experience transforms problems back to questions that arise, and that derive their sense from their motivation. The dialectic of question and answer disclosed in the structure of hermeneutical experience now permits us to state more exactly what kind of consciousness historically affected consciousness is. For the dialectic of question and answer that we demonstrated makes understanding appear to be a reciprocal relationship of the same kind as conversation. It is true that a text does not speak to us in the same way as does a thou. We who are attempting to understand must ourselves make it speak. But we found that this kind of understanding, making the text speak, is not an arbitrary procedure that we undertake on our own initiative, but that, as a question, it is related to the answer that is expected in the text. Anticipating an answer itself presupposes that the questioner is part of the tradition and regards himself as addressed by it. This is the truth of historically affected consciousness. It is the historically experienced consciousness that, by renouncing the chimera of perfect enlightenment, is open to the experience of history. We described its realization as the fusion of the horizons of understanding, which is what mediates between the text and its interpreter. The guiding idea of the following discussion is that the fusion of horizons that takes place in understanding is actually the achievement of language. Admittedly, what languages belongs among the most mysterious questions that man ponders. Language is so uncannily near our thinking, and when it functions it is so little an object that it seems to conceal its own being from us. In our analysis of the thinking of the human sciences, however, we came so close to this universal mystery of language that is prior to everything else, that we can entrust ourselves to what we are investigating to guide us safely in the quest. In other words, we are endeavoring to approach the mystery of language from the conversation that we ourselves are. When we try to examine the hermeneutical phenomenon through the model of conversation between two persons, the chief thing that these apparently so different situations, understanding a text and reaching an understanding in a conversation, have in common is that both are concerned with a subject matter that is placed before them. Just as each interlocutor is trying to reach agreement on some subject with his partner, so also the interpreter is trying to understand what the text is saying. This understanding of the subject matter must take the form of language. It is not that the understanding is subsequently put into words. Rather, the way understanding occurs, whether in the case of a text or a dialogue with another person who raises an issue with us, is the coming into language of the thing itself. Thus, we will first consider the structure of dialogue proper, in order to specify the character of that other form of dialogue. That is the understanding of texts. Whereas up to now, we have framed the constitutive significance of the question for the hermeneutical phenomenon in terms of conversation, we must now demonstrate the linguisticality of dialogue, which is the basis of the question, as an element of hermeneutics. Our first point is that the language in which something comes to speak is not a possession at the disposal of one or the other of the interlocutors. Every conversation presupposes a common language, or better, creates a common language. Something is placed in the center, as the Greeks say, which the partners in dialogue both share, and concerning which they can exchange ideas with one another. Hence, reaching an understanding on the subject matter of a conversation necessarily means that a common language must first be worked out in the conversation. This is not an external matter of simply adjusting our tools, nor is it even right to say that the partners adapt themselves to one another, but rather, in a successful conversation, they both come under the influence of the truth of the object, and are thus bound to one another in a new community. To reach an understanding in a dialogue is not merely a matter of putting oneself forward and successfully asserting one's own point of view, but being transformed into a communion in which we do not remain what we were.